The coffee cup shattered against the marble floor, spraying hot liquid across her worn sneakers, and Marcus Wellington didn't even bother to look down at the black woman kneeling to clean it up. He snapped his fingers twice, like she was a dog, and demanded another espresso, this time with less sugar, because apparently her incompetence extended to following simple instructions. His colleagues laughed, their expensive suits and designer watches glinting under the chandelier of the Pinnacle Steakhouse in downtown Chicago, the most exclusive restaurant in the financial district, where deals worth millions were made over dry-aged ribeyes and bottles of wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The woman, whose name tag read Grace, simply nodded, her dark eyes unreadable, her expression carefully neutral as she wiped up the mess with quiet efficiency. Marcus's friend, Todd Harrison, leaned back in his chair and made a comment loud enough for the entire section to hear about how these people never quite got the service industry right, how maybe she should go back to training or better yet, find work somewhere more suited to her skill level, like a fast food joint. The table erupted in laughter again, and Grace stood slowly, her movements deliberate and calm, gathering the broken porcelain onto her tray without a single tremor in her hands. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined as they sat there in their arrogance, was that in exactly 48 hours, Grace Morrison would walk into their offices not as a waitress, but as their new owner, and that single moment of cruelty would cost them everything they had spent their careers building. But that morning, as Grace endured their mockery with a composure that should have been their first warning, she was still just the help in their eyes, invisible except when they needed something. She had been working at Pinnacle for 3 weeks, taking orders, serving drinks, clearing plates, and absorbing every conversation, every whispered deal, every careless boast about quarterly earnings and upcoming acquisitions. The restaurant was owned by Titanium Hospitality Group, a subsidiary of Wellington Properties, which was itself a division of Harrison Wellington Enterprises, the real estate and investment empire that Marcus and Todd's fathers had built over 3 decades. The younger Wellington and Harrison had inherited their positions as vice presidents, riding on their family names, while the people who actually did the work kept the company profitable. Grace had learned this not from any formal briefing, but from simply listening, from being present in the way that powerful people never notice service workers are present. As if poverty or a uniform rendered someone invisible, stripped them of ears and intelligence and memory. She moved through the restaurant like a ghost, and they spoke freely around her, never once considering that the waitress refilling their water might be paying attention, might be taking mental notes, might be someone other than what she appeared to be. The manager, a thin white man named Gerald who wore his authority like a cheap cologne, caught Grace by the arm as she headed back to the kitchen. He hissed at her to move faster, to stop being so slow, that customers like Mr. Wellington were VIPs and deserved better service than she was providing. And did she want to lose this job because he could replace her in 5 minutes with someone more competent? Grace apologized softly, promised to do better, and Gerald released her with a look of disgust, adjusting his tie as if even touching her had somehow diminished him. In the kitchen, the other staff members, mostly immigrants and people of color who understood exactly what Grace was experiencing, gave her sympathetic looks but said nothing. This was the reality of working at Pinnacle, the price paid for the privilege of serving the wealthy, enduring their disrespect with a smile because rent was due, and families needed feeding and dignity, was a luxury they couldn't afford. Grace slipped into the walk-in freezer for just a moment, letting the cold air wash over her face, steadying herself with slow breaths. On her wrist, barely visible beneath her long sleeve, was a watch that cost more than Gerald made in a year, a Patek Philippe that had belonged to her father, but she kept it hidden, just as she kept everything else about herself hidden, because this particular performance required absolute commitment. She returned to the floor with a fresh espresso for Marcus, setting it down gently beside his plate with a quiet, "Here you are, sir." He ignored her completely, continuing his conversation with Todd about a property deal in Atlanta, something about low-income housing that they were planning to acquire and flip into luxury condos, displacing hundreds of families but generating a profit margin that made Todd grin like a shark. Grace stood there for a moment, waiting. NG to be dismissed, and Marcus finally waved his hand at her without looking up, the gesture one might use to shoo away a fly. She stepped back, but not before she heard Todd mention the date, October 19th, when the final paperwork would be signed, when Harrison Wellington would officially take possession of the Riverside Towers project and begin evictions within 30 days. Grace's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her face remained smooth, professional, forgettable. October 19th was 3 days away, and by then, these men would be answering to her, but they had no idea that the clock was already counting down on their reign. The shift continued with more of the same casual cruelty that people like Marcus and Todd probably didn't even recognize as cruelty, just the natural order of things in their worldview. A snapped finger here, an impatient sigh there, a complaint about the temperature of the food or the speed of service, always delivered with that undercurrent of contempt that suggested Grace was fundamentally less than human, certainly less than them. Another executive, a woman named Patricia Chen who worked in their acquisitions department, actually snapped her fingers in Grace's face to get her attention, then spoke to her in slow, exaggerated words as if Grace might not understand English, asking for her steak to be cooked medium rare. Do you understand? Medium, rare, pink in the middle. Grace nodded patiently, repeated the order back perfectly, and Patricia turned to her companions with an eye roll that said, "See what I have to deal with." The disrespect was so casual, so automatic, that Grace understood it was simply how they moved through the world, believing that their money and their positions elevated them above basic human decency, above accountability, above consequences. But consequences were coming, swift and absolute, in a form they would never see approaching. Grace finished her shift at 11 p.m., her feet aching and her soul weary from the performance she had maintained for 8 straight hours. She changed out of her uniform in the staff bathroom, pulling on jeans and a simple black sweater, removing her name tag and tucking it into her bag. As she walked out the back entrance into the Chicago night, the October air crisp and cold against her skin, her phone buzzed with a message from her attorney, confirming that all documents were in order and the acquisition would proceed as scheduled. Grace allowed herself a small smile then, standing alone in the alley behind Pinnacle Steakhouse, thinking about Marcus Wellington's face when he realized who she was, what she had done, and what it was going to cost him. That smile held no warmth, no joy, only the cold satisfaction of justice delayed but not denied, of a debt that was finally, after years of patience and planning, about to be paid in full. The next morning, Grace Morrison walked into the headquarters of Titanium Capital Management, not through the service entrance, but through the front doors of the gleaming tower on Michigan Avenue. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that had been custom-made in London, Louboutin heels that clicked with authority on the marble floor, and her natural hair was styled in elegant locks that framed her face like a crown. The receptionist, a young blonde woman who had never seen Grace before and therefore had no reason to be anything but professional, greeted her warmly and asked how she could help. Grace identified herself and said she had a meeting with Richard Morrison, the CEO of Titanium Capital, and the receptionist's eyes widened slightly because everyone in the building knew that Richard Morrison didn't take meetings with just anyone. She made a quick call, then directed Grace to the private elevator that served only the executive floor, the doors closing with a soft whisper of expensive engineering. As Grace rose toward the 63rd floor, she caught her reflection in the polished steel and saw not the waitress from last night, but the woman she had always been underneath the disguise, powerful and focused and utterly unforgiving. Richard Morrison was waiting for her when the elevator doors opened, a tall black man in his 60s with silver threading through his close-cropped hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades building an empire from nothing. His face broke into a genuine smile when he saw Grace, and he embraced her tightly, the formal professional distance dissolving into familial warmth. He was her uncle, her father's younger brother, and the only family she had left after her parents had died in a car accident 5 years ago, an accident that Grace had never quite believed was accidental. Richard led her into his office, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, the water gray and restless under the autumn sky. They sat across from each other, and Richard slid a folder across his desk, the weight of it representing months of careful planning, of shell companies and silent acquisitions, of moves made in the shadows, while Harrison Wellington Enterprises remained blissfully unaware that they were being hunted. Inside the folder was the culmination of everything Grace had worked toward since her parents' death. The documents showed that, through a series of strategic purchases made under various corporate entities, Grace Morrison now owned controlling interest in Harrison Wellington Enterprises, the parent company that Marcus and Todd believed was still firmly under their family's control. She had bought up shares slowly, carefully, using different names and different investment vehicles, never acquiring enough at once to trigger any alarms or require public disclosure, always staying just below the threshold that would have revealed her intentions. It had taken 5 years, most of her inheritance, and every bit of her intelligence and determination, but she had done it. Harrison Wellington Enterprises, the company responsible for her parents' death, the company that had cut corners on a construction project that resulted in a building collapse that killed 17 people, including David and Monica Morrison, the company that had used its lawyers and its money to avoid any real accountability, and had paid mere pennies in settlements while admitting no wrongdoing. That company now belonged to her. Richard explained the final steps, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. Tomorrow, October 18th, one day ahead of their scheduled Riverside Towers acquisition, Grace would call an emergency shareholders meeting and reveal her controlling position, effectively seizing control of the company and assuming the role of majority owner and chairwoman of the board. Marcus Wellington, Todd Harrison, and every executive who had helped bury the truth about the Riverside construction disaster 5 years ago would find themselves answering to the daughter of the people they had killed through their negligence and greed. The beautiful symmetry of it, Richard noted, was that they had brought this on themselves. Their arrogance and their assumption that they were untouchable had blinded them to the possibility that someone might be patient enough, smart enough, and motivated enough to take everything from them the same way they had taken everything from her. Grace listened to her uncle's words, but her mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow, to the moment when she would walk into that boardroom and watch their faces change, watch the recognition dawn, watch them understand that their world was ending. But Richard had one more surprise for her, something that made even Grace's carefully controlled composure crack slightly. He explained that his team had been conducting a parallel investigation, working with forensic accountants and former employees who were willing to talk now that they were no longer under Harrison Wellington's thumb. What they had discovered was a pattern of fraud, embezzlement, and criminal negligence that went far beyond the construction disaster that had killed her parents. Marcus and Todd had been systematically looting the company for years, inflating their salaries, awarding themselves bonuses based on fabricated performance metrics, and using company funds for personal expenses that they disguised as business costs. More damning, they had known about the structural problems in the Riverside construction project weeks before the collapse, had received multiple warnings from the site engineer, and had ordered the work to continue anyway, because delays would have cost them a bonus tied to the project's completion date. They had valued their money over the lives of the workers on that site, over the lives of David and Monica Morrison who had been there for a final inspection, over basic human decency. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, enough to trigger not just civil penalties but criminal investigations. Richard had copies ready to be delivered to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Justice, and the Illinois State Attorney's Office the moment Grace gave the word. This wasn't just going to be a corporate takeover. It was going to be a reckoning that would destroy Marcus and Todd personally and professionally, that would see them lose not just their positions, but potentially their freedom. Grace felt something fierce and painful twist in her chest, a mixture of grief and rage and satisfaction that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. Her parents had been good people, brilliant engineers who had dedicated their careers to building things that would last, that would serve communities, that would matter, and they had died because two spoiled rich boys couldn't bear to wait a few weeks and sacrifice a bonus to ensure worker safety. The injustice of it had burned in Grace for 5 years, had driven every decision she made, every sacrifice she endured, and now, she was going to make it right. That night, Grace returned to Pinnacle Steakhouse for her final shift, and the irony of it was almost too perfect. She put on the uniform one last time, tied her apron, and stepped onto the floor knowing that tomorrow everything would change. But tonight she was still Grace the waitress, still invisible, still beneath their notice. Marcus and Todd weren't there this evening, but Patricia Chen was, dining with a group of junior executives and holding court like a queen among peasants. Grace served their table with the same quiet efficiency she had shown all week, enduring Patricia's condescension with a patience that was no longer difficult because she knew it was temporary, knew that in less than 24 hours Patricia would be sitting in a boardroom watching her entire world collapse. When Patricia sent back her wine because it wasn't cold enough, Grace apologized and brought a fresh glass. When one of the junior executives made a crude joke about her appearance just loud enough for her to hear, Grace pretended not to notice and simply cleared their plates without comment. But Gerald, the manager, was in rare form tonight, apparently under pressure from ownership to increase table turnover and boost revenues, and he kept pushing Grace to move faster, serve more tables, stop wasting time. When she politely explained that she was doing her best, he grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks and dragged her into the kitchen, his face red with anger. He told her that he was sick of her attitude, sick of her excuses, and if she didn't pick up the pace she could get out right now, and he would make sure she never worked in a decent restaurant in Chicago again. The other kitchen staff watched in uncomfortable silence, and Grace felt the old familiar rage rising in her throat, the desire to tell this small-minded tyrant exactly who she was and watch him crumble, but she held it back. Not yet. Tomorrow. She nodded, apologized, and returned to the floor, her arm throbbing where Gerald had grabbed her heart pounding with suppressed fury. The shift ended, and Grace changed for the last time in that staff bathroom, looking at her reflection and barely recognizing the exhausted woman staring back at her. 3 weeks of this had been harder than she had anticipated, not physically, but emotionally. The constant assault on her dignity, the relentless dehumanization, the casual cruelty of people who had never been taught that power came with responsibility. But it had also been necessary, had given her a clarity about what she was fighting against that no amount of research or investigation could have provided. She had seen firsthand how people like Marcus and Todd viewed the world, how they treated those they considered beneath them, and it had only strengthened her resolve. These were not good people who had made a mistake. They were fundamentally corrupt, rotten at the core, and removing them from power was not revenge but a moral imperative. October 18th dawned cold and gray, the sky over Chicago heavy with clouds that promised rain. Grace woke early in her apartment in Lincoln Park, a modest 2-bedroom that she had deliberately chosen for its ordinariness. Nothing that would draw attention or suggest wealth. She made coffee, reviewed her notes one final time, and dressed with the care of a soldier preparing for battle. The suit she chose was navy blue, impeccably tailored, paired with a cream silk blouse and pearls that had belonged to her mother. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw her father's determination in her eyes, her mother's grace in the set of her shoulders. They would never see this moment, would never know that their daughter had spent 5 years of her life hunting down the people responsible for their deaths and had finally cornered them. but Grace felt their presence nonetheless, felt them guiding her hand as she picked up her briefcase and headed out the door. The emergency shareholders meeting had been called for 10 a.m., and Grace arrived at the Harrison Wellington headquarters at 9:45, early enough to watch the executives file in, with expressions ranging from confused to annoyed. Emergency meetings were unusual, and none of them knew who had called this one or why, only that it was mandatory for all board members and senior leadership. Marcus Wellington looked particularly irritated, clearly viewing this as an interruption to his important schedule, while Todd Harrison seemed more curious than concerned, probably assuming this was some routine corporate matter that would be resolved quickly. Patricia Chen was there, along with the CFO, the general counsel, and a dozen other executives who had all played their parts in the machine that had killed Grace's parents and buried the evidence. Richard Morrison was already in the boardroom when Grace arrived, and he gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement, but maintained his professional demeanor. Or the other board members, most of whom had been kept in the dark about Grace's acquisition until this morning, looked uncertain and uneasy, not sure what was about to happen, but sensing that something significant was in the air. At precisely 10 a.m., Richard called the meeting to order and explained that there had been a major change in the company's ownership structure that required immediate attention. He yielded the floor to Grace, and she stood, her heart pounding but her voice steady as she introduced herself and explained, in clear legal terms, that she now held 52% of Harrison Wellington Enterprises and was therefore the controlling shareholder, and effective immediately, the chairwoman of the board. The silence that followed was absolute and electric, the kind of silence that precedes an explosion. Marcus Wellington's face went from confused to shocked to red with anger in the space of seconds. He stood up so fast his chair rolled backwards and demanded to know what kind of joke this was. Who the hell Grace Morrison thought she was walking in here and making insane claims? Todd Harrison was pulling up something on his tablet, frantically searching for information, while Patricia Chen sat frozen with her mouth slightly open. The general counsel, a shrewd older man named Bernard Whitmore, asked Grace to provide documentation of her claims, his tone professional but his eyes sharp with concern. Grace calmly distributed folders to each board member, folders that contained detailed breakdowns of every share purchase, every transaction, every legal transfer that had resulted in her controlling position, all of it thoroughly documented and completely legal. Marcus was still sputtering, demanding that someone explain how this was possible, how shares in a privately held family company could have been acquired without his knowledge. Richard Morrison, speaking with the calm authority of someone delivering a death sentence, explained that Harrison Wellington had gone partially public 8 years ago to raise capital for expansion. And while the founding families had retained majority control, enough shares had been available on the market that a patient and well-funded buyer could, over time, accumulate a controlling position. Grace had done exactly that, purchasing shares through multiple entities to avoid disclosure requirements, never moving fast enough to trigger alarms, always staying just below the radar until she had amassed enough power to strike. It was brilliant, it was legal, and it was completely irreversible. Todd Harrison found his voice then, and what came out was ugly and revealing. He pointed at Grace and asked if this was some kind of affirmative action takeover, some diversity scheme, because there was no way she could have afforded this on her own. Someone must be backing her, and he wanted to know who. The racism in his statement was so blatant that even some of the other board members winced, but Grace didn't flinch. She looked at Todd with cold contempt and said that the only backing she needed was her inheritance, the money her parents had left her, money that came from two brilliant engineers who had built their careers on integrity and hard work, qualities that Todd clearly knew nothing about. The mention of her parents seemed to trigger something in Marcus's memory, and his face changed, went pale, and Grace saw the exact moment he made the connection. He said the name softly, almost to himself, Morrison, David and Monica Morrison. And Grace smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator that has finally run its prey to ground. She confirmed that yes, David and Monica Morrison were her parents, the two people who had died in the Riverside construction collapse 5 years ago. The collapse that Harrison Wellington had been responsible for. The collapse that Marcus and Todd had caused through their negligence and greed, and their willingness to value profit over human life. She explained that she had spent the last 5 years learning everything about their company, about their business practices, about their crimes, and accumulating the power to take it all away from them. And now that moment had arrived. The boardroom erupted in chaos, with multiple people trying to talk at once, but Grace's voice cut through the noise like a blade. She announced that as the new chairwoman, her first act was to terminate Marcus Wellington and Todd Harrison from all positions within the company, effective immediately, with cause, which meant no severance, no golden parachutes, nothing. Security would escort them from the building within the hour, and they were to have no further contact with any Harrison Wellington employees or assets. Furthermore, she was initiating a complete forensic audit of the company's finances and operations, and any evidence of fraud or criminal activity would be turned over to the appropriate authorities. The general counsel tried to interject, suggesting that perhaps this was all moving too fast, that there were procedures to follow, but Grace fixed him with a stare and asked if he really wanted to align himself with Marcus and Todd given what was about to come to light, or if he would prefer to cooperate with the new management and possibly retain his position. Bernard Whitmore was nobody's fool, and he recognized a losing hand when he saw one. He nodded slowly and said that of course he would cooperate fully with the new chairwoman and provide whatever legal support she required. Patricia Chen, reading the room with the survival instinct of a corporate climber, immediately began distancing herself from Marcus and Todd, claiming that she had always had concerns about some of their decisions but had been overruled. Grace listened to this display of cowardice with disgust but said nothing, making mental notes about who could be trusted and who would need to be removed in the coming weeks. The other board members, most of whom were independent directors with no personal loyalty to the Wellington or Harrison families, seemed relieved that someone was finally taking charge and addressing what many of them had privately suspected were serious problems with the company's leadership. Marcus tried one more time to regain control, threatening lawsuits, promising that his family's lawyers would tie this up in court for years, insisting that Grace had no idea who she was messing with. But Grace was ready for this, had been ready for 5 years. She nodded to Richard, who distributed another set of folders, these ones containing summaries of the evidence his team had compiled. The financial fraud, the embezzlement, the criminal negligence that had led to the Riverside collapse, all documented with emails, memos, financial records, and testimony from former employees. Richard explained that copies of all this evidence were currently in the possession of the SEC, the DOJ, and the Illinois State Attorney, and that Grace had been cooperating with their investigations for months. Marcus and Todd weren't just fired, they were likely going to prison. The color drained from Marcus's face, and Todd actually staggered, having to grab the table for support. They had never imagined this, had never conceived that their actions might have real consequences, that someone might hold them accountable. They had spent their entire lives insulated by wealth and privilege, believing that rules were for other people, that money could solve any problem, and now they were learning too late that some things couldn't be bought or buried. Security arrived then, 2 professional guards who had been briefed on the situation, and they politely but firmly asked Marcus and Todd to gather their personal belongings and leave the building. Marcus tried to argue, tried to pull rank, but the guards remained unmoved. And finally, humiliated and defeated, the 2 men who had walked into this meeting as vice presidents walked out as unemployed criminals awaiting indictment. In the silence that followed their departure, Grace addressed the remaining board members and executives. She explained that her intention was not to destroy Harrison Wellington, but to transform it, to turn it into the kind of company her parents would have been proud of, one that valued ethics and safety and community over pure profit. There would be changes, significant ones, and anyone who couldn't adapt to the new culture was welcome to leave. But for those who stayed, who were willing to do the hard work of rebuilding the company's reputation and making amends for past wrongs, there would be opportunities to be part of something meaningful. She announced that the Riverside Towers project would not proceed as planned. Instead of luxury condos, the property would be developed as affordable housing, honoring the original intent before Marcus and Todd had corrupted it. The families who had been slated for eviction would instead be offered upgraded units at protected rents, and Harrison Wellington would fund a community center on the site dedicated to the memory of the 17 people who had died in the original collapse. The meeting concluded with Grace formally assuming the role of chairwoman and CEO, a consolidation of power that would allow her to move quickly to implement her vision. As the room cleared and executives filed out, some looking shell-shocked, others thoughtful, Grace stood at the window looking out over Chicago, feeling the weight of what she had accomplished and what still lay ahead. Richard joined her, putting a hand on her shoulder, and told her that her parents would have been incredibly proud. Grace felt tears sting her eyes for the first time in years, the iron control she had maintained for so long finally cracking just slightly, but she blinked them back. There would be time for grief later, time to process everything she had done and everything it had cost her. Right now, there was work due. But Grace Morrison had one more stop to make before she could fully step into her new role. That evening, still wearing her suit from the meeting, she walked into Pinnacle Steakhouse through the front entrance, not the service door. The hostess greeted her warmly, assuming she was there for dinner, but Grace asked to speak with the manager. Gerald appeared moments later, his professional smile fixed in place, asking how he could help her, not recognizing her at all in her tailored suit and confident bearing, proving just how invisible he had considered her when she was wearing a uniform. Grace smiled and reminded him that just last night he had grabbed her arm, threatened her job, and told her she would never work in a decent restaurant in Chicago again. The confusion on Gerald's face was almost comical as he tried to reconcile this powerful woman with the waitress he had abused, his brain refusing to make the connection, until Grace showed him her former name tag that she had kept in her purse. Recognition dawned slowly, followed immediately by fear, and Gerald began stammering an apology, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that he had been under stress, that he had nothing against her personally. Grace cut him off and informed him that as of this morning, she was the majority owner of Harrison Wellington Enterprises, which owned Titanium Hospitality Group, which owned Pinnacle Steakhouse, which meant that Gerald worked for her now. She told him that he was fired, effective immediately, for workplace harassment and assault, and that she would be personally ensuring that his behavior was documented in his employment record. Furthermore, she was promoting Maria Gonzalez, one of the line cooks who had shown Grace kindness during her time there, to general manager, with a mandate to create a workplace culture based on respect and dignity for all employees regardless of their position. Gerald tried to protest, tried to appeal, but Grace was already done with him, turning to the hostess and asking her to please inform the staff that there would be a meeting tomorrow morning to discuss changes in management and improvements to working conditions and compensation. The young hostess nodded, her eyes wide with amazement, clearly having witnessed enough of Gerald's behavior to appreciate the justice of this moment. Grace left Pinnacle feeling lighter than she had in weeks, one more small wrong corrected, one more abuser of power held accountable. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity as Grace systematically dismantled the toxic culture that Marcus and Todd had built and began constructing something new in its place. She brought in consultants to review every active project, halting those that showed signs of the same corner cutting that had led to the Riverside disaster, and implementing new safety protocols across the board. She met with the families of the 17 people who had died in the collapse, offering not just financial compensation but genuine apology and a commitment to honor their loved ones' memories through meaningful change. Many of them were skeptical at first, having been burned by corporate promises before, but Grace's sincerity and her personal connection to the tragedy gradually won them over. The forensic audit revealed even more corruption than Richard's initial investigation had uncovered, and the evidence was damning enough that the U.S. Attorney's Office brought charges against Marcus Wellington and Todd Harrison for fraud, embezzlement, and criminally negligent homicide. The trial became a media sensation, exposing the rot at the heart of the real estate industry and the way that wealthy developers often treated safety regulations as suggestions rather than requirements. Both men were ultimately convicted and sentenced to significant prison time, their families' fortunes decimated by fines and restitution payments. The mighty had fallen, and they had fallen hard, brought down not by regulators or competitors, but by the daughter of the people they had killed, a woman they had dismissed as nothing more than a waitress. Grace used her new platform to become an advocate for construction safety reform, working with legislators to close loopholes and strengthen enforcement, turning her personal tragedy into systemic change that would save lives. Harrison Wellington Enterprises, rebranded as Morrison Development Group in honor of her parents, became known as one of the most ethical companies in the industry, proving that it was possible to be both profitable and principled. Grace hired diverse teams, paid fair wages, invested in communities rather than displacing them, and built structures that would last, that would serve, that would matter, exactly as her parents had always done. 5 years after the hostile takeover, Grace Morrison stood at the grand opening of the David and Monica Morrison Community Center in the Riverside Towers development, surrounded by the family, who now lived in the affordable housing units that had replaced the luxury condos Marcus and Todd had planned. Children played in the park that Grace had funded, their laughter echoing off buildings that had been constructed with care and integrity, and Grace felt something she hadn't felt since her parents died: peace. Not happiness exactly, because the hole their loss had left would never fully heal, but peace in knowing that she had honored their memory, had fought for justice and won, had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and transformed it into something meaningful. Richard Morrison joined her at the dedication ceremony, along with Maria Gonzalez, who now owned Pinnacle Steakhouse after Grace had sold it to her for a fraction of its value, wanting to see it in the hands of someone who understood the dignity of service work. They watched together as Grace unveiled the memorial wall, 17 names carved in granite, 17 lives that mattered, that would be remembered, that had not died in vain, because their deaths had sparked a revolution in how an entire industry operated. Grace spoke about her parents, about their brilliance and their kindness, and their absolute commitment to doing things right even when it was harder, even when it cost more, even when no one was watching. Because integrity wasn't about what you could get away with, but about who you were when no one else could see. The crowd applauded, and Grace allowed herself to cry. Finally, the tears she had held back for so long, grief and rage and satisfaction all mixed together in a release that felt like exhaling after holding her breath for years. She had started this journey broken and angry, had spent years plotting revenge, but somewhere along the way it had become about more than just punishing the guilty. It had become about building something better, about proving that another way was possible, about honoring her parents by living the values they had taught her. Marcus and Todd had treated her like nothing when she was serving their coffee, had never imagined that the black waitress they casually humiliated could be someone powerful, someone brilliant, someone patient enough to destroy them, and that underestimation had been their fatal mistake. Because Grace Morrison had never been nothing, not for a single day of her life, and the fact that they couldn't see her value said everything about them and nothing about her. She had been raised by two of the finest engineers in the country, had graduated top of her class from MIT, had built a career in finance before dedicating herself to this mission, and she had used every bit of her intelligence and resources to take down an empire built on arrogance and blood. The 3 weeks she had spent as a waitress at Pinnacle had been the hardest of her life, not because the work was difficult, but because maintaining that mask of subservience, while people treated her as less than human, had required a strength she hadn't known she possessed. But it had also been necessary, had shown her exactly who these people were, had eliminated any doubt about whether they deserved what was coming. In the end, Grace Morrison didn't just purchase a company, she purchased justice, the kind that courts and regulators had failed to deliver, the kind that money usually insulated people from facing. She had played the long game, had been smarter and more patient than her enemies, and she had won not just a victory but a transformation, turning a corrupt empire into a force for good. The waitress they had treated like nothing had become the woman who owned everything, and in doing so, had proved that power and dignity were never about what others chose to see in you, but about what you knew to be true about yourself. And Grace Morrison had always known exactly who she was, even when she was wearing an apron and cleaning up spilled coffee, even when she was being talked down to and dismissed, even in her darkest moments of grief and rage. She was her parents' daughter, a brilliant and determined woman who understood that the arc of the moral universe might bend toward justice, but sometimes it needed someone willing to grab hold and pull.